What if the woman we think of as a romantic failure was actually a political powerhouse undone by a world not ready for her? What if her great love story was not a romance, but a brutal abduction? Why was a queen born to rule two nations left with no crown and no freedom? Her story is not a simple tragedy. It is a labyrinth of power, propaganda, and personal survival. Number 21. Didn't she sound like a Scot? Mary, Queen of Scots, left her own country when she was just 5 years old. She would not set foot on Scottish soil again for 13 years. Her first language was not English. It was not Scots. It was French. The vast majority of her personal letters, the poems she wrote, the diaries she kept, were all in the language of her adopted home. The image we have of Mary is often shaped by movies. We see an actress with a carefully practiced Scottish accent striding through the Highlands. Feels right. She was the Queen of Scotland, so she should sound like it. But the reality is much more complicated and tells us a lot about why her reign was so difficult. Mary was sent to France in 1548. This was not a casual trip, it was a political move of immense importance. Scotland was caught in a power struggle between England and France. England's king, Henry V, had wanted Mary to marry his son, Edward, to unite the two kingdoms under English control. This plan was known as the Rough Wooing, a series of brutal English invasions designed to force Scotland's hand. The Scots, seeking a powerful ally, turned to France. They signed the Treaty of Haddington, promising their young queen to the French heir, the Dauphin Francis. So, at 5 years old, Mary sailed for the most sophisticated and powerful court in Europe. She was not treated as a guest. She was raised as a future Queen of France. Her education was second to none. She learned Latin, Italian, Spanish, and a little Greek. She studied rhetoric, music, and poetry. She was immersed in French culture, French politics, and the French language. The Scots dialect she might have spoken as a toddler would have faded quickly, replaced by the aristocratic French of the Valois court. She grew up a French princess in all but name. Her companions were French. Her worldview was shaped by French Catholicism and French notions of monarchy. When she finally returned to Scotland in 1561, she was a widow at 18. Her husband, King Francis II, had passed away. She was no longer Queen of France. She was now fully, and for the first time as an adult, the Queen of Scotland. And she was a stranger in her own land. Imagine arriving in a country you technically rule, but barely remember. A country that had undergone a massive religious reformation in your absence. A country where the powerful nobles spoke a language that was, to you, a secondary tongue you had to learn properly. While she could understand and speak Scots, her accent would have been thick with French. Her mannerisms, her fashion, her entire way of being was foreign. This was not just a small detail, it was a huge political problem. It immediately created a barrier between her and her people, and especially between her and the powerful Protestant lords who now controlled much of Scotland. To them, she did not just have a foreign accent, she represented a foreign power, a foreign religion, and a foreign way of life. The Protestant preacher John Knox, her greatest adversary, constantly used her French background to paint her as an outsider, a stranger who could not be trusted. The misconception that she had a native Scottish accent comes from a desire to make her fit our national story. We want her to be wholly Scottish, but her life was international. She was Queen of Scotland, Queen Consort of France, and claimant to the throne of England. Her identity was layered and complex. Her voice was the first and most obvious sign of that complexity. It was the voice of a French royal who found herself ruling a turbulent Scottish kingdom, and that cultural dissonance, that sound of being an outsider, was a challenge she faced from the very first day she stepped back onto Scottish shores. Number 20, was she just a helpless romantic? Mary is often portrayed as a figure ruled by her heart, not her head. A woman who made disastrous romantic choices that led to her downfall. Her marriages to Lord Darnley and the Earl of Bothwell are presented as evidence of her poor judgment and emotional impulsiveness. But this view misses the political chess player that Mary was, at least in the beginning. She did not just fall into these situations. She was navigating a world where marriage was the single most important political tool a female ruler possessed. For a start, Mary did not rush into marriage upon her return to Scotland. She ruled on her own for 4 years, from 1561 to 1565. During that time, she proved to be a capable and shrewd monarch. She went on royal progresses, journeying through her kingdom to meet her people and dispense justice. This made her visible and popular, especially in the Highlands, where support for the Stuart monarchy was strong. She established a working relationship with the Protestant lords, including her own half-brother, James Stuart, the Earl of Moray. She practiced a policy of religious tolerance, allowing the new Protestant church to exist while she continued to practice her own Catholic faith in private. This was a pragmatic and clever move in a country torn apart by religious conflict. Her choice of a husband was not a matter of personal fancy. It was a matter of European strategic importance. Every eligible prince in Europe was a potential match. A marriage to Don Carlos of Spain would have created a Catholic super alliance that terrified Protestant England, and a marriage to a French prince would have renewed the old alliance and posed a direct threat to her southern neighbor. For years, she played a diplomatic waiting game, using the prospect of her marriage to keep other countries off balance and to strengthen her own position. Even her choice of Lord Darnley was, at its core, a political calculation, not a sudden passion. Yes, he was handsome and charming. Mary was a young woman, and that likely played a part. But Darnley's real appeal was his bloodline. He was her first cousin and, like her, a grandchild of Margaret Tudor, the sister of Henry VE. This gave him his own claim to the English throne. By marrying him, Mary did two things. She consolidated two strong claims to the English succession into one line dollars their future children. And she presented a direct challenge to Queen Elizabeth I of England, who had been prevaricating for years about naming Mary her heir. It was a bold, aggressive political move designed to force Elizabeth's hand. Mary was not just picking a husband, she was choosing a weapon in her dynastic struggle for the English crown. The idea of Mary as a hopeless romantic really took hold in the 18th and 19th centuries. Writers and artists of the Romantic era were drawn to her tragic story. They reimagined her as a beautiful, doomed heroine, a victim of love and betrayal. This narrative was far more compelling than that of a calculating politician who made a high-stakes gamble and lost. It stripped her of her agency and turned her into a passive figure in her own life story. The truth is that Mary was both a queen and a woman. She was capable of deep personal feelings, but she was also a monarch trained from birth to think about power, lineage, and strategy. Her early reign in Scotland shows a ruler who was politically astute and determined to succeed. Her marriage to Darnley was not simply a romantic mistake. It was a political strategy that backfired spectacularly when Darnley's true character, arrogant, entitled, and unstable, was revealed. She was not a helpless romantic. She was a political player in a game where the stakes were thrones and she was playing to win. Number 19, was she always at war with Elizabeth? The story of Mary and Elizabeth is often framed as a lifelong, inevitable catfight. Two queens, two religions, two countries, one throne. It's a dramatic and simple narrative, but it is not the whole truth. Their relationship was far more complex, a shifting landscape of rivalry, grudging, respect, and even a strange, long-distance form of kinship. For decades, their primary interaction was not open conflict, but a tense and intricate diplomatic dance conducted through letters and ambassadors. From the moment Mary returned to Scotland, her main foreign policy objective was to be officially recognized as Elizabeth's heir. She was the next in line by blood, but Elizabeth refused to ever name a successor. Elizabeth's logic was simple: to name an heir would be to create an alternative center of power. It would give her enemies a figure to rally around. A second person as I have been, she once said, referring to her own difficult years as heir to her sister, Queen Mary I. So Mary wrote letter after letter to Elizabeth. She called her Madame and good sister. She sent gifts. She proposed a personal meeting, an idea she pursued for years. Mary believed that if they could just meet face to face, woman to woman, queen to queen, they could settle their differences and secure the future of the island of Britain. She envisioned a future of peace and alliance with herself or her son peacefully inheriting the English throne after Elizabeth's time. This was not the thinking of someone seeking constant war. It was the thinking of a pragmatist looking for a long-term solution. Elizabeth's responses were always a masterclass in non-commitment. She was friendly but firm. She offered advice, sometimes welcome, sometimes not. She called Mary dear cousin, but she never gave Mary what she wanted most, the official recognition. Elizabeth's goal was to keep Mary contained. She wanted a stable, Protestant-leaning Scotland on her northern border, not a Catholic queen with a strong claim to her own throne, allied with France or Spain. Their relationship was a constant push and pull. When Mary married Lord Darnley, a man with English royal blood, without Elizabeth's permission, Elizabeth was furious. It was a direct challenge. She saw it as Mary making a power play for her throne, yet even then she did not declare war. She used diplomacy, threats, and support for Mary's Protestant enemies to undermine her. The idea of a constant personal hatred is largely a later invention. It makes for a better story. What existed was a deep and profound political rivalry between two brilliant, powerful women who found themselves in an impossible position. They were cousins, the only two anointed female rulers of their kind in a world of men. They understood each other's predicaments in a way no man could. In one letter, Mary wrote to Elizabeth about the burdens of rule, acknowledging their shared experience. Even after Mary fled to England in 1568, seeking Elizabeth's help, Elizabeth did not immediately move to destroy her. She was deeply troubled by the situation. The idea of subjects rising up and deposing their rightful monarch was terrifying to her. It set a dangerous precedent. Her decision to imprison Mary was a pragmatic one, not one born of pure malice. Mary, free in England or France, was a massive threat. She would become the figurehead for every Catholic plot to overthrow Elizabeth. Imprisoned, she was a problem, but a manageable one. For nearly 2 decades, they continued their relationship through correspondence while Mary was under house arrest. The tone changed, of course. Mary's letters became more desperate, pleading for her freedom. Elizabeth's became more guarded. But the long, drawn-out process shows Elizabeth's deep reluctance to take the final step. She was not a bloodthirsty rival, eager for Mary's end. She was a ruler trapped by circumstance, dealing with a cousin who was, by her very existence, the greatest threat to her life and her kingdom. Theirs was not a simple story of hate, but a long, sad, and complex political tragedy. Number 18, was she a physically frail and delicate figure? Portraits from the 16th century can be misleading. The stiff clothing, the pale complexions, the formal poses, they can create an impression of a person who is delicate, even weak. Combined with her tragic life story, this has led to a common image of Mary, Queen of Scots, as a small, frail woman, easily broken by the harsh men and events around her. The reality was the complete opposite. Mary was a striking and physically robust woman, a fact that often surprised and intimidated those who met her. The most startling fact about Mary was her height. Contemporary accounts consistently place her at around 5 feet, 11 inches tall. In an era when the average height for a man was around 5 feet, 6 inches, she would have been a towering figure. She would have literally looked down on most of the men in her court, including her husband's. This physical presence would have been a powerful asset. When she entered a room, she would have commanded attention without saying a word. This is a far cry from the wilting flower of romantic legend. She was also known for her energy and love of the outdoors. This was not a woman who spent her days languishing inside on a fainting couch. She was an accomplished horsewoman and loved to ride for hours. While queen in Scotland, she would often spend 10 to 12 hours a day in the saddle during her royal progresses or when traveling between palaces. She was an avid hunter and enjoyed falconry. This active lifestyle required stamina and physical strength. Accounts from her time in France and Scotland praise her grace and athleticism. She was known to be a beautiful dancer. She played the lute, but her constitution was strong. Even during her long imprisonment in England, when her health did begin to suffer from the lack of exercise and constant stress, her resilience was remarkable. She endured 19 years of confinement, moving from one cold, damp castle to another without completely breaking down. Her appearance was also a source of comment. She was famous for her auburn hair, her pale skin, and her long, elegant neck. The French courtier Brantome described her as one of the most beautiful women in all the world. But her beauty was not one of fragility. It was one of stature and presence. Her height and confident bearing would have made her seem formidable, especially to ambassadors and courtiers used to dealing with men. So why does the misconception of her as a delicate figure persist? Part of it is the narrative of tragedy. We tend to associate tragedy with fragility. It is easier to pity a delicate victim than a strong woman who fought and lost. Victorian depictions in particular loved to portray her as a tragic, romantic heroine, emphasizing her beauty and her suffering over her strength and resilience. But knowing her true physical nature changes how we see her story. Imagine this tall, athletic, and imposing queen confronting the fiery, much shorter preacher, John Knox. Imagine her towering over her scheming nobles at the council table. Her physical presence was a part of her royal authority. It was another tool in her arsenal as a monarch. She was not a porcelain doll. She was a physically powerful woman in a man's world. And for a time, that physical and personal power served her very well. Number 17, was she a negligent mother? One of the saddest aspects of Mary's story is her relationship with her only child, James. She saw him for the last time when he was just 10 months old. They would never meet again. Because of this long separation, and because James was raised by her enemies to distrust and even dislike her, a narrative has formed that Mary was a bad or uncaring mother. This is a deeply unfair simplification of a heartbreaking situation. Mary's joy at the birth of her son in June 1566 was well documented. The birth of a male heir was a triumph. It secured the Stuart succession in Scotland and massively strengthened her claim to the English throne. She had done her primary duty as a queen. She organized a lavish christening for him at Stirling Castle, a grand affair designed to show the world the strength and legitimacy of her dynasty. Ambassadors from England and France were in attendance. This was the act of a proud mother and a savvy queen. The circumstances that separated her from James were not of her choosing. They were the result of a political catastrophe. After the murder of her husband, Darnley, and her disastrous marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, the Scottish lords rose up against her. They imprisoned her in Lochleven Castle and forced her to abdicate the throne in favor of her infant son. James, just a year old, was crowned King James VI of Scotland. From that moment on, James became a political pawn in the hands of the men who had overthrown his mother. He was raised by her enemies, men like the Earl of Moray, Mary's own half-brother, and later the Earl of Morton. They controlled his education and his environment. They systematically taught him that his mother was a wicked woman, a murderer, and an adulterer who had abandoned him. They showed him the casket letters, alleged proof of her guilt as part of his education. The goal was to ensure he would never seek to restore her to the throne. They needed to sever the natural bond between mother and son for their own political survival. Mary never stopped trying to maintain contact with her son. From her long imprisonment in England, she wrote him letters. She sent him gifts. She knitted him clothes. Most of these were intercepted by his guardians and never reached him. She followed news of his progress and his health with intense interest, relying on snippets of information from her supporters or even her captors. Her letters are filled with expressions of love and longing for the child who was taken from her. She fought for decades, not just for her own freedom, but for her maternal rights. She proposed plans where she and James could rule jointly, a desperate attempt to regain a place in his life and her kingdom. All these proposals were rejected. As James grew up, he was in an incredibly difficult position. He knew his mother was alive, imprisoned in a neighboring country. But his own position as King of Scotland depended on her remaining deposed. To support her would be to delegitimize his own rule. Furthermore, he was also positioning himself to inherit the throne of England from Elizabeth. To ally himself with his Catholic mother, whom Elizabeth considered a dangerous threat, would have been political suicide. So, he kept a public distance. He wrote formal, cool letters to her and engaged in diplomacy that often worked against her interests. It is a terrible thing to judge Mary's motherhood based on a separation that was violently forced upon her. She was not a negligent mother who abandoned her child. She was a deposed queen whose son was taken from her and used as a weapon against her. The psychological impact on both of them is hard to fathom. James grew into a complex, suspicious, and highly intelligent man who had been taught to see his own mother as the villain of his life story. And Mary spent half her life in prison, mourning the loss of her crown, her freedom, and the son she was never allowed to know. Number 16. Did she unquestionably murder her husband? The night of February 10th, 1567, is the pivot on which Mary's life turned. In the early hours of the morning, Kirkfield, the Edinburgh house where her husband, Lord Darnley, was staying, was destroyed by a massive gunpowder explosion. Darnley's body was found in the garden outside, apparently unmarked by the blast. He had been smothered or strangled. The question that has echoed for centuries is, did Mary do it? Protestant propaganda at the time, and many popular histories since, have presented her guilt as a certainty. But the case is far from closed. It remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. To understand the situation, we have to understand Lord Darnley. Their marriage, which had begun as a political power move, had soured into a disaster. Darnley was arrogant, violent, and politically inept. He was consumed with jealousy and a lust for power. He demanded the crown matrimonial, which would have made him king for life, even if Mary passed away. When she refused, he grew resentful. His resentment culminated in the horrifying murder of David Rizzio, Mary's private secretary. Darnley, along with a group of Protestant lords, dragged Rizzio from a private dinner with the heavily pregnant queen and brutally killed him in an adjacent room. This was an act of unimaginable brutality, designed to terrorize Mary into submission. It failed. From that moment, any affection Mary might have had for her husband was gone. She saw him as a dangerous, unstable traitor. So yes, Mary had a motive to want Darnley gone. He was a threat to her life and her rule. But motive is not proof. The case against Mary rests almost entirely on two things: her subsequent marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, the prime suspect in the murder, and the so-called casket letters. We will look at the letters separately, as they are a huge issue in themselves. Her marriage to Bothwell, just 3 months after Darnley's death, was a catastrophic political error. To the world, it looked like a woman marrying her husband's killer, implying she was his accomplice. However, the circumstances of that marriage are deeply suspect. Bothwell was a powerful and ambitious nobleman. He arranged a sham trial that quickly acquitted him of Darnley's murder. Then, in April 1567, he abducted Queen Mary and took her to Dunbar Castle. What happened there is a matter of intense debate. Mary's supporters claim he assaulted her and forced her into the marriage to save her honor and perhaps her life. Her enemies claim she was a willing participant, running off with her lover. Given Bothwell's violent and coercive character, and the fact that Mary was seen in a state of distress, the abduction story is highly plausible. She may not have married Bothwell out of love, but out of necessity and fear. Who else had a motive to kill Darnley? Almost everyone. The Protestant lords who had conspired with Darnley to murder Rizzio now hated and feared him. They knew he was weak and could betray them at any moment. They had even approached Mary months before, suggesting a divorce and hinting that they could find another way to be quit of him. Key figures like the Earl of Morton and Lord Lethington were almost certainly involved in the plot. They had every reason to remove Darnley and to frame the Queen for it, allowing them to seize power. Bothwell was their instrument, and Mary was their ultimate target. There is no direct, verifiable evidence that connects Mary to the planning of the murder. No credible witness ever came forward to say they saw her conspiring. The case against her is circumstantial, built on her disastrous association with Bothwell, and on documents that are now widely believed to be forgeries. It is entirely possible, even likely, that she was aware of plots against her husband. In the cutthroat world of 16th century Scottish politics, plots were constant. But knowing that people want your troublesome husband gone is very different from actively participating in a plan to assassinate him. The verdict of guilty is far too simple. The more likely truth is that Mary was caught in a web of conspiracy woven by men far more ruthless than herself, and Darnley's murder was the trap they used to destroy her. Number 15. Was she an incompetent ruler? The end of Mary's reign in Scotland was so swift and so disastrous that it is easy to assume she was simply a bad queen. The narrative is familiar. She made a couple of terrible marriage choices and lost her kingdom. This implies a lack of political skill and basic competence. But this ignores the first 4 years of her personal rule, from 1561 to 1565, during which she was a surprisingly successful and effective monarch, especially given the circumstances. Mary arrived in a Scotland that was poor, violent, and deeply divided by religion. The Protestant Reformation had swept through the lowlands, but much of the country, particularly the Highlands, remained Catholic. She was a Catholic queen in a newly Protestant nation, a recipe for instant conflict. The powerful nobles were used to running the country themselves and were deeply suspicious of a strong central monarch, especially one with close ties to France. It was an almost impossible situation for an 18-year-old to walk into. Yet, for a time, she handled it with remarkable skill. One of her first and most important decisions was to govern with a council dominated by Protestant lords, including her half-brother, the Earl of Moray. She did not try to impose her own Catholic faith on the country. She issued a proclamation that the religious settlement would remain as she found it. She only asked for the freedom to practice her own faith in the privacy of her chapel. This policy of moderation and tolerance infuriated hardliners on both sides. John Knox preached thunderously against it, and the Pope was displeased, but it was a politically brilliant move. It reassured the Protestant establishment and brought a level of stability that Scotland had not seen in years. She also understood the importance of being seen by her people. She undertook a series of ambitious royal progresses, traveling through different parts of her kingdom. In 1562, she journeyed to the north, a region that was often rebellious. There, she successfully put down a rebellion by the powerful Catholic Earl of Huntly. By doing so, she asserted her authority, proved she was not just a puppet of the Catholics, and won the respect of many Protestant lords who had previously doubted her. She was an active and engaged ruler. She sat for long hours in council meetings, attended to state business, and managed her own finances with care. Ambassadors who met her were impressed by her intelligence, her charm, and her grasp of politics. She was fluent in multiple languages and could converse with foreign dignitaries on her own terms. So what went wrong? The turning point was her marriage to Lord Darnley. As we have seen, this was a political gamble aimed at the English throne. But it shattered the delicate balance she had created in Scotland. Her half-brother, Moray, and his allies saw the marriage to a powerful Catholic noble as a threat. They rebelled, and although Mary successfully crushed their revolt, the unity of her early reign was broken. From then on, she was navigating a minefield of betrayal and conspiracy. Darnley's own destructive behavior, the Rizzio murder, and then Darnley's own assassination created a political storm she could not control. Her ultimate failure was not a result of incompetence, but of a few key, high-stakes decisions that backfired in a political environment that was exceptionally hostile. For 4 years, she demonstrated that she had the skills to be a good queen. She was pragmatic, courageous, and politically intelligent. But in 16th century Scotland, that was not enough. She was a woman, a Catholic, and a queen who believed in the divine right of monarchs, ruling over a Protestant country with a powerful and ruthless nobility that did not share her vision. Her reign did not end because she was a bad ruler, but because her enemies finally found the perfect crisis to exploit. Number 14 was her claim to the English throne, just a vague aspiration. To many people, Mary's pursuit of the English crown seems like a secondary part of her story, a distant ambition that fueled some of her decisions. It is often treated as less important than the high drama of her life in Scotland. In reality, her claim to the English throne was not a side plot. It was the central driving force of her entire political life. It was also not a weak or distant claim. It was powerful, legitimate, and a source of profound and constant anxiety for Queen Elizabeth I Mary's claim came from her grandmother, Margaret Tudor. Margaret was the older sister of King Henry V of England. When Henry V passed away, his own children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, succeeded him. But all three of them passed away without children of their own. According to the normal laws of primogeniture inheritance by the eldest, the line should then revert to the descendants of Henry's sister Margaret. Her granddaughter was Mary, Queen of Scots. By this measure, Mary had a direct and powerful claim to be the next Queen of England. The problem was Henry V's will. In his will, he had attempted to bar the Scottish Stuart line from the succession, favoring the descendants of his younger sister, Mary Tudor. Many, especially Catholics, considered this will invalid. They argued that a king could not simply write the true God-given line of succession out of existence. Furthermore, there was the issue of Elizabeth I's own legitimacy. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry V and Anne Boleyn. And Henry's marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had been annulled by him, but not by the Pope. To Catholics all over Europe, Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn was bigamous and illegitimate. Therefore, their child, Elizabeth, was illegitimate and had no right to the throne. To them, the moment Henry's Catholic daughter Mary passed away in 1558, the rightful queen was not her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth, but their Catholic cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. This was not just a theoretical argument. From the moment Elizabeth became queen, a huge portion of Catholic Europe, including the powerful kings of France and Spain, viewed Mary as the rightful Queen of England. When Mary was in France as the wife of the Dauphin, they openly styled themselves as King and Queen of England, Scotland, and France. They even quartered the English royal arms with their own. This was an explicit and public denial of Elizabeth's right to rule. It was an act of political aggression that Elizabeth never forgot or forgave. This is why Elizabeth was so obsessed with Mary's marriage choices and her actions in Scotland. Mary was not just some troublesome neighbor. She was a living, breathing alternative to Elizabeth. Many of Elizabeth's own subjects, particularly the Catholics in the north of England, believed Mary was their true sovereign. Any sign of weakness from Elizabeth, any crisis could potentially lead to a Catholic uprising in Mary's name. Mary knew all of this. Her entire diplomatic strategy was built around her English claim. Her refusal to ratify the Treaty of Edinburgh, which would have required her to formally renounce her claim, was a constant source of tension. Her marriage to Darnley was a way of strengthening it. Her letters to Elizabeth were all part of a campaign to be named the official heir. So, when we think of Mary, we should not see her as just the Queen of Scots. In her own mind, and in the minds of millions of people across Europe, she was the rightful Queen of England as well. This was not a vague dream. It was a concrete, legal, and dynastic reality that defined her destiny and ultimately set her on a collision course with her cousin, a course that could only end with the triumph of one and the destruction of the other. Number 13 was she despised by all of Scotland. The lords who deposed Mary in 1567 and the Protestant historians who wrote the first drafts of her story were very keen to portray her as a universally hated monarch. They claimed that the entire nation had risen up in righteous anger against a murderous, adulterous tyrant. This was a crucial piece of propaganda designed to legitimize their own rebellion. The truth is that Mary always had a significant base of support within Scotland, and for many she remained the one true queen long after she was imprisoned. Her support was strongest in certain geographical areas and among certain groups. The Scottish Highlands, for example, remained largely Catholic and loyal to the Stuart dynasty. The great Highland clans, like the Gordons, had a long tradition of supporting the crown against the often rebellious lowland lords. During her early reign, Mary's progress to the north and her defeat of the Earl of Huntly, a move that seemed counterintuitive as he was Catholic, actually cemented her authority and gained her respect in the region. Even in the lowlands, support for her was not non-existent. Many of the older, more conservative noble families, even if they had converted to Protestantism, were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of deposing an anointed monarch. The concept of the divine right of kings was powerful. They might have disapproved of her actions, but they believed she was put on the throne by God, and that for subjects to overthrow her was a dangerous and sinful act. When Mary was imprisoned at Loch Leven, her supporters did not simply vanish. They formed a political party known as the Marian Loyalists. They refused to accept her abdication, correctly arguing that it was made under duress and was therefore illegal. This led to a brutal and protracted civil war in Scotland that lasted for 5 years, from 1568 to 1573. On one side were the king's men supporting the regents who ruled in the name of the infant King James. On the other side were the Queen's men fighting for Mary's restoration. This was not a minor skirmish. It was a full-scale conflict that tore the country apart. Major towns and castles were held in Mary's name. The Hamilton family, one of the most powerful in Scotland, were leaders of the Marian cause. Edinburgh itself was divided, with the castle held for the Queen under the command of William Kirkcaldy of Grange, a former ally of the Protestant lords who had switched his allegiance back to Mary. The fighting was bitter and personal, with assassinations and atrocities committed by both sides. The Civil War only ended when Elizabeth I of England finally intervened decisively on the side of the king's party. She sent English troops and siege artillery to help the regent, the Earl of Morton, capture Edinburgh Castle in 1573. Without the prospect of English support, the Queen's party could not win. The fall of the castle marked the end of the last organized military resistance in Scotland on Mary's behalf. But even then, popular sentiment for her did not entirely disappear. For the next 14 years, while she was imprisoned in England, there were still those in Scotland who hoped for her return. The memory of her personal charm, her legitimate bloodline, and the injustice of her overthrow lingered. The idea that she was universally hated is a fiction created by her enemies. She was a divisive figure, certainly. But she also commanded a fierce loyalty that inspired men to fight and lose their lives and lands for her, long after she had any realistic chance of regaining her throne. Number 12, were the casket letters authentic? Of all the evidence used to condemn Mary, Queen of Scots, none is more famous or more crucial than the casket letters. These were a collection of 8 letters, plus some sonnets, allegedly written by Mary to the Earl of Bothwell. They were said to have been discovered in a small silver casket taken from one of Bothwell's servants after he fled Scotland. These documents were presented by Mary's enemies as the smoking gun proof that she was not only in love with Bothwell, but that she had conspired with him to murder her husband Darnley. If the letters were genuine, Mary was guilty. If they were forgeries, the entire case against her collapses. The problems with the casket letters are overwhelming. First and foremost, the original documents do not exist. They were supposedly examined by English commissioners at a conference in 1568, but they have been lost to history. All we have are copies and copies of copies in Scots, English, and Latin. We cannot perform any modern forensic analysis on the handwriting or the paper. We are forced to rely on the conflicting accounts of men who had a vested interest in seeing Mary destroyed. The circumstances of their discovery are also highly suspicious. The man who claimed to have found them was the Earl of Morton, one of the key conspirators against Mary and a man deeply implicated in Darnley's murder himself. The letters were not made public immediately. Morton and the other lords held on to them for months, only producing them when they needed to justify their rebellion against the Queen. This gave them ample time and opportunity to fabricate or tamper with the evidence. Even at the time, there were huge questions about their authenticity. When they were produced at the conference in England, Mary's commissioners immediately denounced them as forgeries. They demanded to see the originals, a request that was never granted to Mary or her team. The contents of the letters were also problematic. Some passages seemed to describe events in a way that contradicted known timelines. The language used in some of the letters was cruder and less sophisticated than Mary's known writing style. The most likely scenario is not a simple case of them being entirely real or entirely fake. It is possible that the conspirators took some genuine, harmless letters from Mary and inserted incriminating lines. This was a common practice in the 16th century. Another theory is that one of the letters was actually written by Mary to Darnley before their marriage soured, and the forgers simply claimed it was for Bothwell. The sonnets in particular are so generic in their language of love and betrayal that they could have been written about anyone or simply been a literary exercise. And Queen Elizabeth's own reaction to the letters is telling. Her commissioners were shown the documents. They declared that they showed Mary to be guilty. However, Elizabeth never acted on this. She did not publicly declare Mary a murderer. Instead, the conference ended with a bizarre open verdict. Nothing had been proven against the Scottish lords for their rebellion, and nothing had been proven against Mary. In effect, Elizabeth used the letters as a political tool. They gave her the perfect excuse to keep Mary imprisoned indefinitely, neutralizing her as a threat without having to make a formal, public judgment of guilt that could have unforeseen consequences. Today, the vast majority of serious historians believe the casket letters were, at the very least, heavily doctored, and are more likely outright forgeries. They were a classic piece of political propaganda created by a group of ruthless men to justify a coup d'etat. The fact that they have been so central to Mary's story for centuries shows just how successful that propaganda campaign was. They are not proof of her guilt. They are proof of her enemy's cunning. Number 11 was Scotland, her lifelong home. Mary's title is Mary, Queen of Scots. It ties her inextricably to one nation. It creates a mental image of a woman who lived her entire life within its borders, her story playing out against a backdrop of Scottish castles and glens. But if we look at the timeline of her 44 years on Earth, we find something surprising. Mary spent only about 12 of those years actually living in Scotland. Her life was split into 3 distinct and almost equally long chapters: her youth in France, her reign in Scotland, and her imprisonment in England. The first chapter, from age 5 to 18, was spent in France. As we have discussed, this was not a temporary visit. This was her entire formative period. She grew from a child into a woman at the heart of the French Valois court. She was the Queen of France for a little over a year. She was more French than Scottish in her language, her culture, her education, and her political outlook. This 13-year period is absolutely crucial to understanding who she was. She was not a Scottish lass. She was a Renaissance princess trained in the sophisticated and dangerous world of European high politics. The second chapter is the one everyone knows: her time in Scotland. She returned in 1561 at age 18 and fled in 1568 at age 25. This period, which defines her historical reputation, lasted only 7 years. It was a turbulent, dramatic, and ultimately tragic time, but it was a remarkably short part of her life. During these years, she was a reigning monarch, grappling with the realities of her kingdom for the first time. The third and final chapter is the longest. From 1568 until her execution in 1587, Mary was a prisoner in England. This period lasted 19 years. 19 years. That is more than her childhood in France, and almost 3 times as long as her actual reign in Scotland. For 19 years, she was a queen with no kingdom, a woman under constant surveillance, moved from one castle or manor house to another, a pawn in the long, cold war between Catholic Europe and Protestant England. During this long imprisonment, her life was not static. She became the focal point for numerous Catholic plots against Elizabeth. She maintained a secret correspondence with her supporters across Europe. She managed her household, dealt with her captors, and never ever stopped scheming and hoping for her release and restoration. Her health suffered in the damp English climate, but her spirit remained famously resilient. This was not a passive waiting period. It was a long, grueling battle of wills, fought with letters, codes, and secret messages. So, while she was the Queen of Scots, her life was truly a European one. She was a French queen, a Scottish ruler, and an English prisoner. The misconception that she was a purely Scottish figure misses the international scope of her story. She was a player on a much larger stage. The forces that shaped her were French. The kingdom she briefly ruled was Scottish. And the nation that held her captive and ultimately took her life was English. Each of the 3 parts of her life is essential to understanding the whole, and the longest part of her adult life was not spent on a throne, but in a gilded cage. Number 10 was Bothwell, the great love of her life. The story is a classic of romance and betrayal. A passionate queen trapped in a miserable marriage falls head over heels for a dashing, dangerous nobleman, the Earl of Bothwell. Together, they conspire to get rid of her inconvenient husband. And then, in a rush of passion, they marry, defying the world and sealing their own doom. It is a powerful narrative, and it is almost certainly false. The idea that James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, was the love of Mary's life is a misconception built on enemy propaganda and a misunderstanding of the brutal realities of power and coercion in the 16th century. It is true that Bothwell was a staunch supporter of Mary and her mother, Mary of Guise, for many years. He was a powerful border lord, a skilled soldier, and utterly ambitious. Mary trusted him as a loyal and effective military commander. He was one of the few powerful Protestant nobles who consistently backed her. There was a relationship of trust and political reliance. But there is no evidence of a romantic relationship between them before the death of her husband, Darnley. The proof of their love affair comes from the casket letters, which, as we have seen, are almost certainly forgeries designed to create exactly this impression. The real story of their marriage is much darker and has all the hallmarks of a political coup and an abduction. After Darnley's murder, Bothwell, as the chief suspect, behaved with incredible audacity. He packed his own acquittal trial with his own followers, making a guilty verdict impossible. Then, just 2 months later, he made his move. As Queen Mary was returning to Edinburgh from visiting her son at Stirling, Bothwell appeared with a force of 800 men. He intercepted the Queen's party and, in no uncertain terms, abducted her, taking her to his castle at Dunbar. Mary's own account, and those of her supporters, is that she was taken against her will. At Dunbar, they claim Bothwell forced himself upon her. In the 16th century, this act had devastating consequences for a woman's honor, even a queen's. For Mary, marriage to Bothwell may have become the only way to salvage her reputation and perhaps even to survive. She was his captive, surrounded by his men, with no army to rescue her. To resist could have meant her own end. Her enemies, of course, claimed she was a willing participant, that the abduction was a piece of theater staged to give her an excuse to marry a man she was already in a relationship with. But her behavior does not support this. People who saw her in the days after the abduction described her as being in a state of despair and sorrow. This does not sound like a woman who has just run away with the love of her life. Their marriage lasted only a month. The Scottish lords, many of whom had secretly signed a pact, the Ainsley Tavern Bond, supporting Bothwell's marriage to the Queen, suddenly used that same marriage as the pretext for a rebellion. They raised an army, claiming they were rescuing the Queen from her captor. At Carberry Hill, the two armies faced off. Mary, seeing that her own forces were likely to desert, surrendered to the lords on the condition that Bothwell be allowed to go free. He fled, and she never saw him again. He would eventually pass away in a Danish prison. This is not a great love story. It is a story of a ruthless nobleman seizing an opportunity. Bothwell saw a widowed, vulnerable queen and a power vacuum. He eliminated her husband, then he took possession of her, believing that marrying the Queen would make him the most powerful man in the country, perhaps even king. For Mary, the marriage was not the culmination of a romance, but the final catastrophic event that cost her everything. It was not an act of love. It was likely an act of survival under extreme duress. Number 9 was she a zealous Catholic crusader. Mary's Catholic faith was undeniably at the core of her identity. In a Europe torn apart by the Reformation, she was a devout Catholic monarch. Her enemies, particularly John Knox and the Protestant reformers in Scotland, portrayed her as a dangerous agent of the Pope, a Jezebel, who had come to Scotland with the secret intention of stamping out the new faith and restoring Catholicism by force. This image of her as a religious fanatic, however, does not square with the political realities of her reign. For most of her time in Scotland, Mary pursued a policy of religious compromise and pragmatism, not crusade. When she arrived in Scotland in 1561, the country had already officially become Protestant. The Scottish Parliament had adopted a Protestant confession of faith and outlawed the Catholic Mass. Mary was in a precarious position. She was a Catholic queen of a Protestant nation. A less intelligent ruler might have tried to immediately reverse the Reformation, an act that would have triggered an instant civil war and likely cost her the throne. Mary did the opposite. She recognized the political reality. She agreed to govern with her Protestant council and declared that the religious status quo would remain untouched, at least for the time being. Her only non-negotiable demand was that she and her household be allowed to hear Mass in the privacy of her royal chapel. This was a policy of limited toleration. It was a practical solution to an otherwise unsolvable problem. It kept the powerful Protestant lords on her side and maintained peace in the realm. This moderation infuriated the hardliners. The Protestant preacher John Knox famously railed against her from his pulpit at St. Giles' Cathedral in Edinburgh, declaring that one Mass was more fearful to him than if 10,000 armed enemies were landed in any part of the realm. On the other side, the Pope and other Catholic leaders in Europe were critical of Mary for not doing more to help the Catholic cause in her kingdom. She was walking a political tightrope. Her actions bear this out. She did not engage in any persecution of Protestants. She did not attempt to restore the Catholic Church's lands and power. She even took up arms against the powerful Catholic Earl of Huntly when he defied her authority. This demonstrates that her priority was to establish herself as the strong, lawful monarch of all Scots, not just the leader of a Catholic faction. Her goal was a stable kingdom, which she knew was impossible without the cooperation of the Protestant majority. It was only later in her reign, after her marriage to the Catholic Lord Darnley and the increasing hostility of the Protestant lords, that her policies began to shift. She began to explore the possibility of seeking more support from Catholic powers like Spain, and later, during her long imprisonment in England, she certainly became a symbol and a willing participant in the Catholic struggle against Elizabeth's Protestant regime. In her mind, the Catholic cause became intertwined with her own cause for freedom and restoration. But to read this later position back into her early reign is a mistake. The Mary who ruled Scotland from 1561 was not a crusader. She was a pragmatist. She understood that her survival as queen depended on compromise. The image of her as a religious zealot was a caricature created by her enemies, a powerful piece of propaganda used to stoke fear and justify their eventual rebellion against her. For the years she held power, her approach to religion was one of the most moderate and statesmanlike in all of war-torn 16th century Europe. Number 8. Did Elizabeth always plan to execute her? The final image of Mary's life is of her on the scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle. It seems like the inevitable conclusion to her long rivalry with Elizabeth. Because we know the ending, it is easy to assume that from the moment Mary set foot in England in 1568, her fate was sealed and Elizabeth was just biding her time. But this view misunderstands Elizabeth's own character and the profound political and personal dilemma that Mary's presence created for her. For 19 years, Elizabeth actively resisted the calls from her advisors to execute Mary. Elizabeth was a monarch who believed deeply in the sanctity of royalty. The idea of putting an anointed queen on trial, let alone executing her, was abhorrent. It set a terrifying precedent. If subjects or even a fellow monarch could kill one queen, what was to stop them from killing another? Elizabeth knew that signing Mary's death warrant would weaken the very institution of monarchy that kept her in power. She was also Mary's cousin, her own kinswoman. Despite their rivalry, there was a bond of blood that she was deeply reluctant to break. From the moment Mary arrived, Elizabeth's council, led by the staunchly Protestant and pragmatic Sir William Cecil, saw Mary as an existential threat. They argued that as long as Mary lived, she would be a magnet for Catholic plots, a figurehead for rebellion, and a potential pawn for foreign powers like Spain or France, who might invade England to place her on the throne. They were right. The next 2 decades saw a succession of plots centered on Mary the Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and finally, the Babington plot. After each one, Cecil and others would pressure Elizabeth to eliminate the source of the danger, and each time, Elizabeth refused. She explored other options. She considered restoring Mary to the Scottish throne under strict conditions. She tried to negotiate a treaty. She moved Mary from castle to castle, trying to keep her isolated. Her long imprisonment of Mary was not the first step in a plan for execution. It was an attempt to contain a problem she did not know how to solve. She once lamented her position, saying, "I have the wolf by the ears. meaning she could neither safely hold on nor safely let go. The turning point was the Babington Plot in 1586. Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, intercepted a series of coded letters in which Mary explicitly approved of a plan to assassinate Elizabeth. This was the undeniable proof of treason that Walsingham and Cecil had been waiting for. They had caught her in the act. Even then, Elizabeth agonized. She was pushed into a trial, and Mary was found guilty. Parliament demanded her execution. The pressure was immense. Elizabeth signed the death warrant in February 1587, but even after signing it, she was hesitant to have it dispatched. The historical record shows she was in a state of turmoil, possibly hoping for a last-minute solution. It was her council, led by Cecil, who took the initiative and sent the warrant to Fotheringhay without her final explicit command. When Elizabeth found out Mary was dead, she reacted with a mixture of fury and grief. She claimed her counselors had acted against her wishes. She even had her secretary, William Davison, imprisoned in the Tower of London for his part in it. How much of this was genuine, and how much was political theater to placate an outraged France and Scotland is debatable. But what is clear is that the decision to execute Mary was the most difficult and painful of Elizabeth's long reign. It was not a pre-planned act of vengeance. It was a last resort, a political necessity forced upon a queen who resisted it for almost 2 decades. She did not always want Mary dead. For most of Mary's captivity, Elizabeth desperately wished for any other solution. Number 7, was she uneducated and frivolous? The Protestant reformer John Knox, one of Mary's chief adversaries, famously wrote of her and her ladies in waiting as the stinking pride of women. He and other reformers painted a picture of a frivolous court led by a queen interested only in dancing, music, fashion, and French fripperies. This image of a shallow, uneducated woman, ill-equipped for the serious business of ruling, has stuck. It is a gross misrepresentation. Mary was one of the most highly educated women of her age. Her education at the French court was comprehensive and rigorous. It went far beyond the typical accomplishments for a high-born lady. She was fluent in French, her primary language, and also proficient in Latin, which was the international language of diplomacy and scholarship. She also learned Italian, Spanish, and some Greek. When she returned to Scotland, she had to improve her command of Scots and English, but her linguistic abilities were formidable. She was also well-versed in the classical subjects. She studied rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing, a skill crucial for any ruler. She read the works of classical authors. She wrote poetry herself, mostly in French, which shows a sophisticated understanding of meter and form. A number of these poems and letters survive and demonstrate a sharp, articulate mind at work. Beyond the academic, her education was designed to make her a queen. She learned to play musical instruments like the lute and the virginals. She was taught to dance with grace. She was an expert needlewoman, but these were not just frivolous pastimes. They were part of the expected skill set of a Renaissance monarch, tools of soft power used to display culture and refinement at court. She was also a skilled and fearless horsewoman, an activity that required physical courage and endurance. Her love of fashion was real. Her accounts show she spent lavishly on beautiful gowns made of velvet and silk, and she was famous for her collection of jewels. But again, this was not simple vanity. In the 16th century, a monarch's appearance was a direct reflection of their power and status. A magnificently dressed queen projected an image of wealth, stability, and authority. It was part of the theater of monarchy. When she presided over her council meetings in Scotland, her ministers and visiting ambassadors were often surprised by her quick intelligence and her grasp of complex political issues. She was not a passive figurehead. She engaged in debates, asked probing questions, and had her own clear ideas about policy. The propaganda of Knox and others was deliberately designed to undermine her. By portraying her as frivolous and ungodly, they could question her fitness to rule a sober Protestant nation. They contrasted her lively, music-filled court with their own austere vision of a godly society. It was a clash of cultures, and Mary's French Renaissance court was an easy target. But the caricature they created should not be mistaken for the reality. Mary was a sharp, cultured, and highly intelligent woman who had been given the best education Europe could offer. She was anything but uneducated. Number 6 was her imprisonment in England and easy captivity. The phrase under house arrest can conjure images of a comfortable, if restricted, life. We might imagine Mary living in luxury, a queen in a gilded cage. For 19 years she was the guest of the Earl of Shrewsbury at the English state's expense. But the reality of her long captivity was psychologically grueling, physically damaging, and filled with the constant anxiety of surveillance and uncertainty. It was anything but easy. To begin with, she was not kept in one place. Over the 2 decades, she was moved between various castles and manor houses, including Bolton Castle, Tutbury Castle, Sheffield Castle, and Chartley Hall. Many of these places were not luxurious palaces. They were often cold, damp, and in poor repair. Tutbury Castle, in particular, was notorious for its terrible conditions, with bad sanitation and a constant unhealthy chill. These moves were often made at short notice, disrupting the small sense of stability she might have had. They were also a security measure designed to prevent escape attempts or rescue plots. Her freedom was severely curtailed. She was allowed to take supervised walks or rides, but she was always surrounded by guards. Her household was a mixture of her own loyal servants and English spies placed there to watch her every move. Her jailer, the Earl of Shrewsbury, was under immense pressure from London. He was responsible for her with his life and fortune. This made him a cautious and often strict warden. The financial burden of housing the Scottish queen and her retinue also nearly bankrupted him. The most difficult aspect of her confinement was the psychological toll. She was a queen, accustomed to power and activity, now reduced to a life of monotonous routine. Her letters are filled with complaints about her declining health. She developed severe rheumatism, likely exacerbated by the damp conditions of her prisons. She suffered from pain in her side, and her legs would often swell, making it difficult to walk. The lack of vigorous exercise and the constant stress undoubtedly took a heavy toll on her once robust constitution. Her correspondence was her lifeline to the outside world, her only way to engage in politics and plead her case. But it was also her greatest danger. All her letters were intercepted, read, and often deciphered by Elizabeth's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham. She knew she was being watched. She had to use complex codes and find secret ways to smuggle letters out, constantly aware that a single misplaced word could be used against her. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and constant tension. She was also a mother separated from her only child. She received little news of her son James, and the news she did get was often filtered through her enemies. She lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty. For years, she clung to the hope of release, a trial that would clear her name, or a diplomatic solution. As the years turned into decades, that hope began to fade, replaced by a grim resignation. So, while she was not in a common dungeon, her imprisonment was a form of slow, psychological torment. It was a life of boredom, ill health, constant surveillance, and fading hope. To call it an easy captivity is to ignore the profound human cost of those 19 lost years. Number 5, did she willingly give up her throne? On July 24th, 1567, Mary, Queen of Scots, signed documents abdicating her throne. She passed the crown to her 1-year-old son James and appointed her ambitious half-brother, the Earl of Moray, as regent to rule in his place. On the surface, it looks like a voluntary surrender, an admission of defeat. This was precisely the impression the rebel Scottish lords wanted to create. The truth is that Mary's abdication was anything but voluntary. It was an act carried out under extreme duress while she was a terrified prisoner who feared for her life. The context is everything. After her surrender to the lords at Carberry Hill, Mary was not treated as a queen. She was paraded through the streets of Edinburgh while a mob jeered at her, holding up a banner depicting the dead body of her husband Darnley. She was then imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle, an imposing fortress in the middle of a loch, owned by the family of the Earl of Moray. Her jailer was Lady Douglas, Moray's mother, a harsh woman who had her own personal grievances against Mary. In this isolated and intimidating setting, Mary was subjected to weeks of psychological pressure. She was ill, possibly having suffered a miscarriage, and she was, cut off from her supporters. Then the lords sent their envoys to her with an ultimatum. The senior statesman, Lord Lindsay, a man known for his brutal temper, was one of them. They presented her with the abdication papers. They told her that she had to sign, or worse would follow. The threat was not veiled. They made it clear that if she refused, she would be put on public trial for the murder of Darnley. In the current climate, with them in total control, such a trial would have only one outcome: a guilty verdict, followed by a public execution. Lord Lindsay is said to have laid the papers down and made it plain that her life depended on her signature. Crying and fearing for her life, Mary signed the documents that stripped her of her crown. From a legal standpoint, an agreement signed under such coercion is invalid. Mary knew this. As soon as she managed her daring escape from Loch Leven, nearly a year later, her very first act was to formally revoke the abdication. She declared that she had signed it in fear of her life and that it was null and void. Her supporters rallied to her, and the civil war began. The lords, however, immediately used the abdication document as the legal basis for their new government. They crowned the infant James VI at a Protestant ceremony and established Moray's regency. To the outside world, especially to Queen Elizabeth in England, they presented themselves as the lawful government, acting on the authority of a voluntary abdication. They needed this fiction to gain legitimacy. The story of the forced abdication is a stark example of the ruthlessness of Mary's opponents. They did not just defeat her on the battlefield, they systematically stripped her of her authority, using legal instruments backed by the threat of violence. She did not give up her throne. It was taken from her. The image of her signing away her kingdom in a moment of despair is a powerful one, but it should always be remembered that there was a hand holding a metaphorical and perhaps literal weapon just out of frame. Number 4 was John Knox, her only real opponent. John Knox, with his fiery sermons and his book, The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women, is certainly Mary's most famous antagonist. Their dramatic face-to-face confrontations are legendary. It is tempting to view the conflict in Scotland as a personal battle between the charming Catholic queen and the stern Protestant preacher. But to focus only on Knox is to miss the much larger and more dangerous opposition Mary faced. Knox was the loud public voice of the Protestant cause, but the real power lay with the Council of Protestant Lords. These men were not just religious reformers, they were powerful landed aristocrats with their own armies, their own ambitions, and a long history of challenging royal authority. The group included men like James Stuart, the Earl of Moray, Mary's own half-brother, the Earl of Morton, Lord Lindsay, and the cunning Secretary of State, William Maitland of Lethington. These were the men who truly ran Scotland. Their opposition to Mary was complex. Religion was a part of it. They were committed to ensuring Scotland remained a Protestant nation and were deeply suspicious of Mary's Catholicism. But their motives were also political and personal. They had grown accustomed to power during Mary's absence in France and during her mother's regency. They were not eager to give it up to a young, determined queen who believed in a strong monarchy. Mary's half-brother, Moray, is a key example. He was her chief advisor in the early years and the head of the Protestant faction. While he worked with her, he was also constantly working to advance his own power. He was the main beneficiary of her downfall, becoming regent for her son. His ambition was a far greater threat to Mary than Knox's sermons. The Earl of Morton was another formidable opponent. He was a ruthless and greedy man, one of the key figures in the murders of both Rizzio and Darnley. He too would eventually become regent, ruling Scotland with an iron fist. These men were not just debating theology with Mary. They were engaged in a lethal power struggle for control of the country. Knox was, in a sense, their spiritual weapon. His preaching could whip up public opinion in Edinburgh. He could provide the religious justification for their political actions. He gave their rebellion a cloak of moral and divine righteousness, but Knox had no army. He could not imprison the queen or lead a rebellion. The lords could. The confrontations between Mary and Knox are famous because they are so dramatic. The highly educated French-raised queen debating theology and the rights of monarchs with the unyielding, fire and brimstone preacher from a humble background. Mary often seemed to get the better of him in these debates using her sharp intellect and legalistic arguments. But winning a debate with Knox did not matter if she could not win the loyalty of the men with the swords in the land. Focusing only on Knox simplifies the story into a battle of personalities and fates. The reality was a political battle between the crown and the aristocracy, a conflict that had been raging in Scotland for centuries. Religion was the new explosive element in this old struggle. Knox was the match, but the Protestant lords were the gunpowder. Number 3, did her son, James, simply forget her? The relationship between a son who became king and the mother he never knew is bound to be complex. James VI of Scotland was raised from infancy by the men who had overthrown his mother. He was taught she was a villain. He built a successful career as a king, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England, a feat his mother had dreamed of. Because he did not move heaven and earth to save her, and because he maintained a pragmatic relationship with her executioner, Elizabeth I, it is often assumed he simply forgot about Mary, or that he felt nothing for her. This is too simplistic. James was a king before he was a son, and his actions were governed by a cold political realism, not a lack of feeling. James was in an impossible position. His entire identity as king was based on his mother's deposition. If he were to ever admit that she was the rightful queen, he would be admitting that he himself was a usurper. His hold on the Scottish throne was often shaky, dependent on balancing the various noble factions. To champion his mother's cause would have been to ally himself with the losing side of the Scottish Civil War and risk his own crown. His primary goal, especially as he grew older, was to secure his inheritance of the English throne. Elizabeth I never named him her heir officially, but he was the obvious and logical candidate. The key to this prize was maintaining a good relationship with Elizabeth. He knew that any aggressive move to help his mother would be seen as a hostile act by the English queen and could destroy his chances. He chose his future crown over a mother he could not remember. It was a brutal calculation, but from the perspective of a 16th century monarch, it was the only logical one. This does not mean he was without feeling. There are hints of a more complicated emotional reality. When his mother was put on trial in England, he made a formal, if rather weak, protest. He sent ambassadors to plead for her life. The fact that his efforts were not very forceful was noted at the time, but he could not afford to push Elizabeth too far and risk being disinherited. He was walking a fine line. After her execution, James's public reaction was one of anger. He made speeches and seemed to be considering an invasion of England. But this was likely political theater for his own nobles, many of whom were outraged by the execution of a Scottish queen. In the end, he did nothing. He accepted Elizabeth's somewhat unbelievable apology that the execution was a mistake carried out by overzealous officials. Within a couple of years, he had accepted a pension from Elizabeth, and their relationship was back on a pragmatic footing. But later in his life, once he was securely on the English throne as King James I, he took steps to honor her memory. In 1612, he had his mother's body exhumed from its grave in Peterborough Cathedral. He brought her to London and had her reburied in a magnificent marble tomb in Westminster Abbey. This tomb is in the south aisle of the Henry VII Chapel, a place of honor. It is, in fact, a grander monument than the one he built for his predecessor, Elizabeth I, which lies in the north aisle. This final act can be read in many ways. It was a public declaration of his mother's royal status. It was a son's final tribute. It was also a powerful political statement by a Stuart king, now ruling over all of Britain, cementing his own dynasty's legitimacy. He did not forget his mother. He simply could not afford to remember her until it was politically safe to do so. His entire life was shaped by her shadow, and his final gesture in Westminster Abbey was a quiet but powerful acknowledgement of the mother he never knew but could never truly escape. Number 2 was her story, just a rivalry between two women. And Mary, Queen of Scots, versus Elizabeth, Queen of England, it is one of the most compelling personal rivalries in history. Two powerful women, cousins, queens, one Catholic, one Protestant, locked in a decades-long struggle for a single island. This framing is so powerful that it often obscures the much larger context. Mary's story was not just a personal drama. It was a European story, and she was a major piece in the great geopolitical chess game of the 16th century between the continent's superpowers France, Spain, and the papacy. From the day she was born, Mary was an international figure. Her mother was French, from the powerful de Guise family. Her first marriage made her the Queen of France. The Auld alliance between Scotland and France meant that Scotland was seen as a French satellite, a backdoor into England. Mary's very existence maintained this threat to English security. After she returned to Scotland, she became the great hope for Catholic Europe. The Counter-Reformation was in full swing. The Pope, the King of Spain, Philip II, and the powerful Catholic faction in France saw Mary as the key to reclaiming Britain for the Catholic faith. They believed if she could take the English throne, she would reverse the English Reformation, a huge blow to the Protestant cause. This is why they were so interested in her marriage prospects and so willing to support plots on her behalf. When she was imprisoned in England, she became the living symbol of the Catholic cause. Philip II of Spain, Elizabeth's greatest rival, saw her as a potential puppet. His famous Spanish Armada in 1588 was launched with the stated aim of overthrowing Elizabeth and restoring Catholicism, a plan that would have involved placing a Catholic monarch on the throne. Had Mary still been alive, she would have been the obvious choice. The plots that swirled around her during her imprisonment were not just the work of a few disgruntled English Catholics. They were often funded and encouraged by foreign ambassadors acting on the instructions of their kings. The Spanish ambassador in particular was expelled from England for his involvement in plotting. Mary's fate was therefore of intense interest to the rulers of Europe. Her execution sent shockwaves across the continent. It was seen as an outrageous act by a heretic queen against a legitimate Catholic sovereign. The King of France protested. The King of Spain was further emboldened in his plans against England. It raised the temperature of the Cold War between Protestant and Catholic Europe. To see Mary's story as just about her and Elizabeth is to see only two players on the board. In reality, the hands of the Pope, the King of Spain, and the King of France were constantly moving the pieces, trying to manipulate the situation to their advantage. Mary was not just a Scottish queen who had a problem with her English cousin. She was the Catholic claimant to the English throne in an age of brutal religious warfare. Her personal tragedy was played out on a vast international stage, and her life and death had consequences that stretched far beyond the shores of Britain. Number 1. Did she always dress in mourning? The most enduring image of Mary, Queen of Scots, comes from the portraits painted late in her life during her long English imprisonment. In them, she is a somber figure dressed in black, her face pale and sorrowful. This, combined with the black she wore on the day of her execution, has created a popular misconception that she was a perpetually mournful figure who only ever wore dark colors. This could not be further from the truth. For most of her life, Mary was a vibrant and fashion-conscious woman who loved color, luxury, and style. The inventories of Mary's wardrobe tell the real story. These detailed lists, compiled at various points in her life, describe a collection of gowns of breathtaking color and richness. She had dresses of crimson velvet, gowns of cloth of gold and cloth of silver, and outfits in purple, blue, and orange. Her clothes were heavily embroidered with pearls, jewels, and intricate threadwork. She was a true Renaissance princess, and she dressed the part. During her time at the French court, renowned for its opulence, she was considered a fashion leader. Her tall, graceful figure was the perfect frame for the elaborate styles of the day. She loved jewels and had a famous collection, including the Great Harry, a spectacular diamond inherited from her great-grandfather Henry VII. When she came to Scotland, she brought her French fashion sense with her, a stark contrast to the more austere style favored by the Protestant reformers. Her vibrant court was a source of constant irritation to men like John Knox, who saw it as a sign of vanity and foreign decadence. She did wear white for a period of mourning after the passing of her first husband, King Francis II of France. This earned her the nickname La Reine Blanche, or the White Queen. But this was a specific period of formal mourning. Once it was over, she returned to her usual colorful attire. The black outfits we associate with her come from the very end of her life. During her trial and at her execution, she chose to dress with a deliberate and powerful symbolism. On the day of her execution, she appeared on the scaffold in a dress of black velvet. It projected an image of a solemn, wronged queen, but beneath this black dress, she was wearing a kirtle and petticoat of deep crimson, the liturgical color of Catholic martyrdom. When the executioner removed her black outer garments, the revelation of the blood-red attire was a final, shocking piece of political theater. She was sending a clear message. She was not dying as a traitor, but as a martyr for her Catholic faith. The portraits of her in black from her captivity also served a purpose. They were a way of visually communicating her plight as a captive queen, removed from the joys and splendors of a normal royal life. But we should not let this final tragic chapter color our entire perception of her. For most of her life, Mary, Queen of Scots, was a woman who embraced life, color, and beauty. The somber figure in black is the image of the prisoner and the martyr, not the young, vibrant queen who once dazzled the courts of France and Scotland.